The internet has become an integral part of our lives. We rely on it for communication, education, marketing, managing finances, traveling, and the list is endless. It has made our lives easier. Recently, Google services like Gmail and YouTube went down across the world. Multiple countries were hit by this outage, except for China. Western companies have taken over the Indian market. Many today are questioning the interdependence of standards set up in the West and tech dependence on the West. But what happens if one fine day Google crashes? Does India have a backup? India does need a strategy to break the hegemony of the West. Technological developments and innovations are what the country needs to boost overall economic growth. This is exactly how the East India Company established its roots in India. Today, Western technology companies have created partnerships with companies in India, created the interdependence, and they make money out of it. This revenue is used to build new generation technologies, while India follows. India has a large youth population educated in technology. It has all the resources it needs to develop an integrated system that could make India self-reliant. But what the established Western tech giants have built is brand loyalty. In today's world, physical invasion is not the only way to colonize. It has changed over the years. Lots of information is circulated digitally. These platforms could be a private multinational company and not necessarily government. They have the authority to control activities using their database. Earlier this year, Google said it would invest $10 billion in India over the next 5 to 7 years. The partnership comes out of an exciting but critical stage in India's digitization. It's been amazing to see. The partnership aims to bring many more Indians online. At the same time, the majority of people in India still don't have access to the internet, and fewer own a smartphone, so there is a lot of work ahead. India needs a robust ecosystem of its own, where each time any individual pushes a byte, it should not be going to the United States and then coming back. It must be able to marry in with its own checks and balances. Each byte transferred from a computer needs to go hit an Indian server, and India must have its own checks and balances so that its global marriage makes sense to India. The Indian ecosystem should be able to handle every byte that leaves the computer. And if tomorrow a global breakdown happens, India is ready. But to achieve that, it's going to take a state-driven vision and backing. For that, the political system will have to take its head out of the sand and begin looking beyond. But until then, India's reliance on Western technology companies will continue to rise, and India will continue to be a chaser. Bureau Report, Democracy News Live, New Delhi. Welcome to Democracy News Live. It matters. It's the show we do every evening to kind of analyze what's going on in our news world and current affairs world today. We've decided to pick up this issue because certainly it's an issue that's been dogging South Asia. The interdependence on technology, what and where South Asia stands. Is it really independent? Is it capable of existing on its own? Or is it only reliant, whether it's technology with defense jets, whether it's technology, whatever is in the horizon, if it's completely dependent and still not what the Indian Prime Minister described as Atmanirbhar, then what's going to happen in the future? Digital colonization, concept coined by Jaijit Bhattacharya, who's joining us today, is something that he talked about, is how India continues to look at the West. While India's neighbor China has obviously found a way around it, it understood that digital is where all the challenges are going to sit. Digital is how the world is going to get driven, and that's where it needs to continue raising its stake, bringing in 5G, making sure technologies are within, making sure the applications like, for example, the messenger apps we use, is something that China has built inside. It uses that within the country to talk to each other, which means a tremendous amount of very sensitive information stays within the servers of China and doesn't ever leave the borders. And these are challenges that countries like India will have to understand. 1.3 billion of the population, which is one sixth of humanity, every sixth human being is an Indian. But still, what you're doing is you're reliant on the rest of the world. We are here to discuss this. Our three guests today: Jaijit Bhattacharya, uh, he's an IIT professor, also former partner at KPMG. Also joining me today is Abhishek Agrawal. Abhishek Agrawal is the founder of Atlantis Research. He is sitting in Florida today. And joining me is Ankit Goel. He works on artificial intelligence and semantic analysis. He's founded a company which is going live very soon with a news app. And all three of them are going to weigh in and tell us a bit about where are the challenges and what are the challenges and what will it take for a country like India to build an ecosystem which is not entirely dependent on the West. Let me bring in Jaijit first. Jaijit, explain to me, when you coined the word digital colonization, what did you really mean?
So I think the word colonization essentially reflects access to markets. It reflects disproportionate economic benefit being derived out of a market. So why the word colonization in the context of technology? It is because most of industrial development and most of exports and most of trade and the economy is actually technology and was always technology. For example, if you take India, somehow it's a misconception that India was an agricultural country and it was exporting agriculture. We were exporting vegetables to Europe. That clearly is not true. That's a ridiculous assumption. What we were exporting was highly technologically sophisticated outputs. We were exporting wood steel, which was being used to build any weapons worth its salt anywhere in the world. If you had to build a high quality sword, a high quality blade, it had to be based on wood steel, which was coming from South India and from Sri Lanka. If you had to take ships, it had to be Indian ships because they were the best, they were the biggest, they were the strongest. In fact, to the extent that in the 17th century, the British Parliament actually passed a law saying that if any goods is brought on an Indian ship, not an Indian shipping line, but on an Indian ship, then there has to be extra taxes to be paid. And that is because most of the shipping lines in Britain were actually preferring to buy Indian ships over any other ships because they were technologically superior. And by putting in these taxes, they actually saved the British, the very, very nascent British shipping industry, and they decimated the Indian shipping industry. And that's a story that kept on happening in terms of textiles, in terms of zinc extraction. In fact, the funny thing about zinc is that the technology was stolen from the Zorawar mines, and it went to UK. It was patented, and then was given back to Hindustan Zinc mines to actually start using the technology at the same Zorawar mines in Rajasthan from where the technology was stolen. So, cutting the long chase short, essentially what we are saying is the economy is largely dependent on technology. You look at the Californian economy, it is almost as big as the Indian economy with only 50 million people, right? And what is fueling that economy? It's being fueled by technology, by the Facebooks, by the Googles, and so on and so forth, by Apple, right? These are the technology companies which are fueling the growth of California. And same is the case anywhere in the world. You're getting growth because of technology. Now, if you start losing control over colonies, right, where you are getting a disproportionate economic benefit because you had political control, how do you continue to have the kind of lifestyle you want, the kind of high income that you want for your people once the global political situation has changed and you no longer have control over these resources? You have to therefore construct a different kind of technological trade regime, which will then help you maintain your hegemony. And how does this regime get constructed? This regime gets constructed through trade agreements, it gets constructed through patent regimes, through IPR, which were shoved down the throats of all the countries. If you recollect, IPR and patents really became very, very critical more in the 1960s when the professors from US started getting exported to institutions like my own alma mater, like IIT Kanpur, IIT Delhi. They started getting exported to these places to teach, quote unquote, what is IPR and what is patent and why is patent so important and why should we not violate any of these. Whereas historically, if you look at the impact of patents and IPRs and so on, they actually constrained technology creation, not really helped in technology creation. Steam engine almost died because of the patents that were put in by Watt. And by the way, James Watt is widely known to have not created the engine. It was already created by other people. He had the wherewithal to go to the British Parliament and not only patent it, but extend that patent for another 30 years, in which time the efficiency of the steam engine was so little that it did not make any sense to transport anything on steam engine. It was only when it was open source and people freely started putting in their ideas through a open source journal called Lean Engine Reporter did the efficiency of steam engine really go up. So therefore, coming back to 1960s and trying to impose a new regime of patents, of IPR, and so on and so forth, was only happening because by the 1960s, the last of the colonies had gone out. So how do you really impose disproportionate economic benefit? And here is where I have put in my own definition of colonization. And colonization is not just a political colonization. It's any situation where you get disproportionate economic benefit by manipulating the rules of engagement either through deceit or by force. So what was happening
Sure.
earlier was within the same society, you would have colonization with an upper class or upper caste or upper whatever in the segment not doing really much and controlling the land and the resources and getting everybody else to work for them. That changed into the classical political colonization where you actually controlled the politics of the place, and therefore you change the tax regime. You actually put a tax on exporting textiles and put a tax and made imports tax free and so on and so forth. And that's how you extracted disproportionate economic benefit. Cutting it in today's world, that benefit is getting extracted by ensuring that the rest of the country or rest of the world does not have access to technology. Therefore, they don't have access to data. Therefore, they don't have access to the future of technology either. And just to demonstrate what that means is, Rohit, you are using a laptop which suddenly after 2 to 3 years somebody comes and says it's obsolete. It's declared obsolete, right? Why is it obsolete? Because after 3 years you end up doing exactly the same thing, which is making presentations, making spreadsheets, and making Word documents and browsing, which you have been doing for the last 20 years. What has changed, and why does every 3 year your laptop slows down, your phone slows down, and you're told you're obsolete? It is because it is architected that way, right? and
Right.
and and every part of that stack, right from the operating system to the network to the chip to the processor to the BIOS to the screen, everything is architected in that fashion. And typically around this time of the year the entire technology clock moves. So if you are not part of this ecosystem, which is largely based in the West, you will be left
Right.
out,
No,
right? And
absolutely.
that is what has been smashed through by China. So I'll stop over here. Obviously, Rohit,
Sure,
I can
sure.
go
Let
on
me,
this
let me.
topic.
No, no, no.
But
No, it's a good point. No, I'm glad you set the stage, Jaijit. I think it's a very important bit. You coined it for a reason, and that's why I wanted you to set the stage of the discussion. Let me bring in Abhishek here. Abhishek, you sit there in the West right now. Do you see that there is nothing in the world, in the technology world, even though a large human resource comes from South Asia? But there is nothing that India sets the stage for in the rest of the world when it comes down to technology. Do you think India is digitally colonized?
Yes, of course. I completely agree. And, like you were talking about Google going out, it's not just Google not working that is having a large impact on us. It's also the political agendas behind Google, right? If you search on Google, Google will show you what you want, what they want you to see. And if you go on another search engine like Bing, you see a completely different set of search results. So politically, they're trying to control what you see and how you perceive the world. So it's not just the economic benefits, but also the political impact they have on us. And if you talk about the West, a lot of people are now waking up to India, and then they understand that India is technologically advanced. We're not what Slumdog Millionaire showed us to be, but at the same time we're not making a large enough impact that the Western world looks at us the way they look at other countries like the UK and Germany. So we
Or
still
China
have
for
a
that
big.
matter?
Yes, but China is a very controlled environment, right? They control even what their own people see. We don't want to be like China. We want to be an open India where political parties are not controlling how the data
Sure,
is fed to us.
sure. Sure. Now, let's look at when you talk about how Google may control what you see, you have to remember this is all a cycle. 80% of all digital revenue out of India, 50% is with Google and approximately 30% is with Facebook. 80% of all digital revenue goes to these two companies. Only 20% is left for the others. So there is very little that can be done in when you get down to digital revenue and how it's going to get spent. The reality is also that it's not as if Google had this plan. Google got into the search business in the early 2000s, and that's when a lot of people began using these apps. So by design, they planned a strategy to make sure that there were a lot of people using their apps. And then at the end of the day, everybody was on it, and here they were sitting pretty because they had the technology around it, which means you need future thinking when it gets down to this. Let me bring in Ankit Goel here. Ankit's a semantic an analyst. He works on artificial intelligence. Ankit, explain to me. You obviously are working around tech, and Google certainly is a very important part of semantic analysis as we look through search engines and all of that. But what if Google was not there, or you were told Google doesn't exist? Will your technology even last beyond Google?
So, the fun thing that's happened is that, um, like, Google has created a market for itself, and like you said, it's approached it by scale. But at the same time, they've gone through this exercise where they've open sourced certain technologies, making newer, younger companies actually dependent on the technologies that they have released out in public. Right. So even moving forward, what they've actually done is that they've gone ahead and created this certain dependency among all upcoming businesses. And by the time those companies grow up and they're in a stage where, okay, we have the manpower and the funding required to go ahead and do our own, they're already so dependent, it's like they're hooked. And it's really hard to break away at that point of time. So coming back to your question, if Google wasn't there, the space, yes, would be quite open, but at the same time, we all remember pre-Google, right? Where we had maybe like an Alta Vista and a Yahoo, and I mean, there are great benefits that Google brings. It's hard to take away from that. Um, but yes, we might have had more of a space. But honestly, the way I see it is that uh, the beautiful thing about digital colonization, as opposed to pre-World War colonization, actually, is that at that point of time we did not have a choice. It was either take my money or have my gun in your face. Today we actually stand at the place where, with the right ingenuity, we can go ahead and create the technology that pushes us beyond whatever. So I think a great example is Facebook, right? When Facebook came up, Google was already a big giant, Microsoft, Apple, all of them, and Facebook came in, just took everyone by storm. And barely a couple of years, we right now we can't even imagine replacing a Google, a Facebook, or a Twitter. So I mean,
So
that's the
what you're
fun of
saying
part
is
of
we
it.
are digitally still colonized. All three of them are American companies. None of them are Indian
Most
companies, right?
most definitely, one of my biggest issues is that if you look at all the devices on your body and look at all the apps that you carry, almost all of them have an Indian developer, an Indian research scientist having an arm, a leg, or a brain involved. But none of the IP belongs to an Indian, right? So we are involved through and through, but we own none of it.
So we all agree, all four of us, that digital colonization is in full swing today. What we need to understand, I think let's have that discussion, is where do we go from here? What will it take to actually build an ecosystem? We're not going to have it in 5 years, we'll not have it in 10 years, but let's talk 30 years, 50 years from now. What needs to be done? First steps to be taken to build an ecosystem which is sustainable, which is not interdependent with others, where you can crash. Even if the rest of the world goes away, the system has to stay intact. Jaijit, what will be the first steps to be taken to build that ecosystem?
I'm glad you used the word ecosystem because that's linked to what was mentioned by my co-panelist as choice. We actually don't have the choice because we are part of an ecosystem that actually does not provide a choice. So, for example, if I create a better prefetch queue for a microprocessor, Unless an Intel or ARM or Nvidia says, yes, I'll take it, my better prefetch queue is useless because I'm not part of the ecosystem. And that's basically what's happening at a larger scale. So that's a symptom. And therefore, having the ecosystem end becomes a very important point. I think a good example is to look at China. China was nowhere 20 years back. It was not in the radar for being a cutting edge technology provider, and it had taken very conscious steps. And there were a series of events which I'll not get into given the paucity of time on this program, but there were a series of events that happened that woke up China, and they vowed to be the leader of technology and therefore also dominate the world in that sense. And therefore, it's possible to actually not wait for 40 years, 50 years, but do it in a short span of 10 to 15 years if we reorient ourselves. One of the key issues that we're having is when we talk about technology development, we believe that we should actually get into the trenches and develop the systems, the ecosystems, the partner networks all from scratch. That is not the way to create technology. It has to be buying of technology. It has to be buying of ecosystems. It has to be a mix of everything. It has to be to bring in skills from outside. We believe Indians have lots of skills, but that's not really true. And Indians who are in India really don't have the high end skills that are actually fueling some of these technologies. They are still in the west coast of US, and they may be Indians doing it, but they're not Indian Indians. They are US Indians. They're American Indians, and therefore having a multi-pronged strategy which leads to creating the ecosystem that you mentioned, Rohit, is the way forward, which provides us the headspace. Why is it that Google is out there? Why is it that before Google it was Microsoft, or before Microsoft it was Alta Vista and Yahoo all at the same time? They were all US companies. Why is it that US companies are getting that headspace? Because it's the government who created that headspace. They created that headspace for either a Google or a Neo Google or a Neo Google plus plus to come up, and they will come up. One day Google will get destroyed. That's the nature of business and so on. But the next entity will also be an American entity if we do not create the headspace for Indian entrepreneurs and Indian businesses to be out there. And one of the more important points within this whole ecosystem situation is the ability to provide market. In fact, colonization is all about market access. If we don't provide markets for entrepreneurs who are into high risk business, then we will not have those entrepreneurs. We'll not have a Google which can bet that large. Google, had multi-billion dollars betted before they started making a single pie out. If I go back to the last decade, Korea, China, US, France, Japan, they all provided a huge amount of support and de-risk investments into batteries, into lithium-ion batteries, because they saw the writing on the wall that the next set of generation of technologies will be battery-based, and therefore, if somebody is betting into that risky, non-existent market, the government said, we will give you market, we will ensure so many vehicles will have batteries in it, and we will give you subsidies, or else we will buy it out. Therefore, de-risked the entrepreneur from getting into that market. And that's something which is extremely critical. We need to de-risk the next generation of technology creators, the next big Google out there, which comes from India. So those are the few steps that are needed to be done on an immediate basis.
Jaijit, you raised it, and I'm going to, take that, example from you. Talking about de-risking entrepreneurs, who put out, and then understanding where technology is moving, and then riding on it. So I was talking to somebody who's building EV, vehicles for conversion kits. He said, I cannot create a standard conversion kit and give it to the cars and say, it's certified kit, you can install it, it works. He says, every time we install the conversion kit in a different car, the car has to go through a huge process. Even in Germany, that doesn't happen, where they're very, very strict about technology. So systems here are created to create speed breakers for technology to get integrated, which means entrepreneurs who go out will end up failing in 3-5 years. They'll fail, and then they'll go back. Then a large American company will come, or a German company will come. It will float in all of that, and then they will succeed. And then people will wonder, why don't Indian entrepreneurs succeed? Because the government puts in all the breakers in between so that they fail, because they aren't going to be paying any kickbacks. But when a company comes with 50,000 units, they'll end up paying a little bit of kickback, and they go right through. So I think that's where the challenge lies. People being caught up, and I think that's where one of India's largest challenge lies, is giving headspace, as you mentioned in the beginning, of understanding where the room is, where the development is required. And that headspace can only come with vision. It cannot come without vision. Let me, sure, go ahead, Jaijit.
Sorry, just because you took that example, I just want to underline it with a real life example of an EV vehicle provider who's building a trike where it's a three wheeler with the two wheels in the front and one wheel in the back. Guess what? It cannot be AR AI certified because AR AI does not have a category of such a vehicle. And we'll have that category once Germany has it and US has it, but we will not do it for our own entrepreneurs. And it just underlines what
Absolutely.
you're saying.
Absolutely. You're absolutely on the ball. Let me bring in Abhishek here. Abhishek, if you were to guide the Indian government about where the next steps are going to be in creating that headspace and creating the ecosystem, what would be your advice be? You sit there and, just outside in Florida, just outside NASA, building technology there. Tell me, what is that's missing that needs to be built?
So I'll give you another example from my own life, right? I invented the water rocket system that's used for teaching sciences in schools, and it became extremely popular in the U.S. We're working with a lot of school districts, and we were manufacturing it in China. But after COVID, I decided it was time to move manufacturing to India. And the biggest problem we are having in that process is most of the stuff that we use, even down to small screws, is not available in India. So for me to set up manufacturing in India, I have to import a lot of stuff from China. And to do that, I've been asked to bribe the customs agents. And without the bribe, the stuff cannot get in from China. So one of the things that we need to do is figure out how to streamline this process of importing stuff that is absolutely not available in India, or setting up manufacturing for all of those small run-of-the-mill things that are extremely important in manufacturing to be available in an M2 screw, which is so small. Most Indian manufacturers don't feel the need for manufacturing it, but it is one of the most important screws that we use. So stuff like that becomes extremely important. When you're talking about high-end technologies, it's the same exact thing. Anything that we want to bring in, including lithium-ion batteries, you have to go through a very long process to import the same battery that is easily available in the US without any certification. So, that I understand there are pros of certifying imports from China, but then we need to make alternate equipment available in India if we are doing that. And our country doesn't do it. We just create hurdles, but we don't provide solutions to those, or turnarounds on those hurdles.
Absolutely. And so again, you're talking around ecosystem. And again, I'm going back to what Jaijit had talked about, is we may not have all the materials today, we may not have all the technology or the knowledge today, but we need to build all of that. We may need to bring in some of that to start with, but that's how we'll build the whole thing. I remember Narendra Modi went with this robot to show Melania Trump in Hyderabad. When I met the founder of that company which had made the robot, he said the amount of challenges they had bringing in parts for building that robot, which India was showcasing to Melania Trump as here is this beautiful robot made in India, was actually such a huge challenge. I bought an air conditioning system which claimed it was made in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat. But when I opened that machine up, 90% of the parts were actually made in China. And it had won all kinds of awards around this country. So, getting our head together of how we're going to build India or what it's going to take to build India is something Indians need to understand, the government needs to understand. Ankit, you've been around the Indian ecosystem. You've kind of, you've seen what happens in the Indian ecosystem, and especially in the news business and in other semantic analysis. What's missing? What is that's completely missing? And what are the skills that are available? As Jaijit talked about, we don't have all the skills, and it's true, those skills don't exist. I've worked very closely with Ankit as I built a content management system based on artificial intelligence for an Indian news media outlet. So explain to me, Ankit, what's missing in the whole system.
So there's a couple of things missing. So one of like what Jaijit said, one of the primary things that's missing to quite an extent is the skill set. Now the skill set is going to come in if we actually start nailing down on the sort of education that we're giving our techies, right? For a large part, all of us tend to skim through college and university. No one really cares. And that's a very different approach from the way you see it in the West. Those same students, when they go abroad and they study, they understand that they cannot be copying. They cannot be any plagiarism and stuff like that. But while they're in India, it's a joke. In fact, there are a lot of applicants that I see, for careers, and many of the PhD students, the research papers that they have posted are actually copies of older research papers. So, that's one part. But apart from that, there was another piece that was brought to light recently for me, which was policies. And this goes in line very much with respect to what all of you guys have been talking about. And policy making is actually quite an essential component. We can be as smart as we want, right? We can have all the financing, but like he said that he had custom issues, or we had governmental issues and things like that. So that policy making part is very important. I believe even Mark Zuckerberg actually mentioned it sometime back, wherein he said that the policy part about how they're working together with the government is becoming very crucial, and this is not something he had ever envisioned. And that's, I think, is the core of it. We need to make the guys at the helm actually understand what they are stopping us from doing, right? We are not trying to fill their coffers, or rather, if you enable us, we will really fill your coffers up, right? And that is much more important. And that's the long-term vision that you said a lot of them are not seeing. My only silver lining in this whole thing, honestly, has been over the last couple of years, the government, due to the whole Make in India thing, has actually started taking initiatives where they want to work with Indian companies and Indian industries. I have read a lot of blogs and articles about founders and other companies who are like, what, we deliver and work with foreign defense companies, but when we approach the Indian defense, they're like, I'm sorry, we won't deal with you, but they'll go through their American partners. And that is something that we have seen changing a bit. There's still a way to go, but we're seeing that, and that mentality of the government, of the bureaucrats, that requires changing, as like the wheels are turning. They're not there yet, but I mean, they're moving at least. So I'm hoping we're in the right direction, and that I believe is the largest sign. Everyone else has literally echoed the exact
Sure.
same thing.
Sure. So, digital colonization or Western hegemony when it comes to technology is a big issue. Certainly needs to be addressed. Each country, which is a developing nation, needs to think about its own ecosystem and development of its ecosystem policies that are built around progressive approaches, not backward, inward looking approaches, and not corrupt approaches, certainly. We've seen many countries who've gone the corruption route where they stand. Other countries literally own them. If you see some countries, they gave out their ports and lands, and then technical infrastructure, gave out its 5G networks, and now today are staring at challenges going forward. So India needs a full-on digital system of its own, an ecosystem, servers. If it needs to marry with anybody outside, there should be a quid pro quo. There should be an exchange of data rather than one-way data going out and coming in. And that's where the world needs to sit at if India needs to look forward and go ahead and be what it wants to be, a leader of sorts. Thank you, Jaijit. Thank you, Ankit. Thank you, Abhishek, for joining me for this show to kind of explain digital colonization. We look forward to having you guys again. Good night and good luck.